Get off this ship! You don't belong here!
Nobody standing on the sun-drenched boarding dock of the luxury cruise liner Aurora that Tuesday morning could have guessed that a single act of cruelty would bring the entire operation to its knees before noon. The ship was immaculate, 240 feet of gleaming white steel, buffed railings that caught the Florida morning light like polished silver, a crew of 163 trained to smile with their eyes and anticipate needs before they were spoken. Passengers arrived in chauffeur-driven SUVs, in private taxis with tinted windows, wearing linen the color of cream and sunglasses that cost more than a month's rent in most of the country. Everything about the Aurora that morning was choreographed, precise, controlled a performance of luxury so practiced it had almost become real. The boarding area gleamed. Porters in pressed white uniforms moved luggage with quiet efficiency. Jazz played from a hidden speaker system, barely audible but present, a sonic cue that the world of the everyday was already behind you. And then Evelyn Brooks stepped onto the dock, and not a single thing about her fit the frame. She was 53 years old, medium height, with close-cropped, silver-threaded hair, and the kind of posture that comes not from private school, but from a lifetime of deciding not to shrink. She wore a plain navy blue dress, flat shoes, and carried a single carry-on bag that had seen better decades. Her rolling suitcase was the sort that college students checked under overhead compartments, modest and slightly scuffed at the corners. She had no jewelry except a thin gold band on her right hand and small pearl studs in her ears. She moved through the dock crowd with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long ago stopped measuring herself by what other people saw. She checked no mirrors as she walked. She adjusted nothing about herself in response to the glances that were, even before she reached the check-in queue, already accumulating around her. A couple near the gangway, both in matching resort wear, both holding branded water bottles, exchanged a glance when Evelyn passed them. It was not an ugly glance. Precisely. It was the kind of glance that happens before conscious thought catches up. A quick recalibration. A silent question mark. She doesn't look like she belongs here. The thought moved through the crowd like a low frequency, unspoken, and therefore impossible to challenge. 3 other passengers shifted almost imperceptibly as she walked by. A young woman in oversized sunglasses lowered them to look, then raised them again. 2 elderly men near the boarding gate paused their conversation. It was the kind of attention that presents itself as not attention peripheral, deniable, and entirely real. Evelyn did not notice, or if she did, she gave no indication. She joined the check-in queue with the same ease she had always brought to rooms that were not built for her. She had a small leather folder tucked under her arm. Inside it, her booking confirmation, her identification, her boarding documents, all of it organized with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent 3 decades managing things that mattered. She had booked this voyage 6 months earlier. She had paid in full, in cash transfer, without fanfare. She had chosen the Aurora specifically because she had been told the Mediterranean route was stunning in early autumn, and because at 53, after everything she had built and everything she had given away, she had decided that she was allowed to go somewhere beautiful and simply sit on a deck and watch the water move. She had told no one at the company who she was. She had booked as Evelyn Brooks, private citizen, no affiliation listed. Victor Harlan noticed her the moment she joined the line. Victor was the Aurora's guest services manager, 41 years old, 11 years in the cruise industry, and possessed of the particular brand of institutional confidence that comes from never having been seriously corrected. He was not a cruel man, in the way that obvious villains are cruel. He did not enjoy the discomfort of others for sport. He was something more common and more dangerous. A man who had organized the world into categories so thoroughly that he could no longer see the people inside them. He had learned the hospitality industry in a version of it where the right type of guest was a recognizable type, and where the gatekeeping that kept things orderly was considered a professional skill rather than a character flaw. He had been promoted 3 times on the strength of that skill. Nobody had ever told him it was a flaw. He watched her from across the boarding area for nearly 4 minutes before he approached. He was already making decisions. His face had that practiced composure of someone who is about to say something he has said before, a scripted courtliness, hiding a foregone conclusion. Other passengers moved through the queue, their documents scanned, and returned with the easy efficiency of a system designed to welcome them. Evelyn reached the front of the line. Victor stepped forward before the junior staff member could. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "Good morning," he said, with the particular tone of someone who means neither word of it. "I'm going to need to take a look at your booking documentation." He held out his hand. Evelyn opened her leather folder and placed the documents in it without hesitation, without anxiety, without any of the defensive body language he might have expected. Victor took the papers and studied them, with the focused attention of a man searching for something wrong. The booking reference was valid. The name matched the identification. The payment was confirmed. Every line was exactly as it should be. He looked up and then looked down again, and then looked up once more. "This is a suite booking," he said, as if that were a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who has explained herself many times and has decided long ago that the explaining is not the problem. "Deck 7. I booked it in March." Victor handed the documents back to her. Then he asked to see them again. He compared the booking confirmation number to his tablet 3 separate times. He asked her to verify her date of birth, her home address, the last 4 digits of the account the transfer had come from. Each answer she gave was immediate and correct. Each correct answer seemed to land somewhere inside him, not as resolution but as provocation, as if her competence itself were somehow suspicious. Around them, other passengers had begun to move more slowly. The queue had quieted in the way that queues do when they sense that something is happening. Nobody wanted to look directly. Everyone was watching. "Ma'am," Victor said finally, lowering his tablet, "I have to be transparent with you. These documents appear to have some inconsistencies that require our security team to review." There were no inconsistencies. Every person within earshot who might have leaned in to hear better already understood, on some quiet animal level, that there were no inconsistencies. But Victor had said it with such polished neutrality that it was nearly impossible to argue with the language of bureaucracy wielded as a kind of aggression. The formal sentence structure of procedure used to do the work that outright accusation would have done more honestly. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "What inconsistencies?" she asked. Her voice was still level. Victor's smile tightened. "It's a standard verification procedure," he said. "We appreciate your understanding." Evelyn said she did not understand. She said so, clearly, and without heat. She said that her documents were valid, that she had confirmed her booking the previous week with the company's customer service line, and that she would like to board the ship. Victor said that would not be possible until the review was complete. The queue around them had stopped entirely. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat leaned toward her husband and murmured something. He nodded, not taking his eyes off the scene. A teenager in a polo shirt pulled out his phone and held it at his side, camera angled forward. A crew member near the gangway pretended to study a clipboard. The morning sun was high, and the air smelled of salt and diesel. And something else now, the electric charge of a confrontation that everyone present would later remember differently, depending on what they had come ready to see. Victor raised his voice. It was a gradual escalation, performed in increments small enough to seem reasonable at each step, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. He said that the booking appeared to have been made using fraudulent credentials. He said the name on the identification did not match the name associated with the payment method on file, which was not true. He said that individuals attempting to board using fraudulent documentation would be escorted off the premises by port security. He said it in the efficient tone of a man reading policy, as if the policy made it less of what it was. Around them, the crowd had tightened. People stood 3 deep now. Some of them had their phones out openly. Not a single person said anything. A few looked at Evelyn with expressions that hovered somewhere between sympathy and the instinct to preserve their own comfort by remaining uninvolved. No one stepped forward. No one said, "Wait a moment," or "This doesn't seem right," or "Let me see those documents." The silence of the crowd was not malicious. It was something more ordinary than malice. It was the desire to stay on the right side of a situation whose parameters had not yet been fully determined. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. After Victor's last accusation landed in the air between them, something moved across her face. Not anger, not humiliation, not fear. Something older than all 3. She had been in rooms like this before, in forms that did not involve luxury cruise ships. She had sat across desks from men who had decided before she arrived what she was worth. She had stood in lobbies and elevators and offices and known the particular feeling of being assessed and found wanting by people who had never taken the time to look. She had been denied tables at restaurants, flagged in stores, treated with that specific quality of false courtesy that performs welcome while communicating its opposite. She knew what this was. She had known it from the moment Victor stepped forward to take her documents out of the junior attendant's hands. She was not going to cry. She was not going to raise her voice. She was going to do the one thing she had learned, across 5 decades of navigating a world not designed for her, that such men never expected. She was going to be completely, immovably calm. "I would like to speak with the captain," she said. Victor Harlan looked at her the way people look at a child who has said something unreasonable. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I can assure you this matter is being handled at the appropriate level." Evelyn said nothing. She did not move. She stood with her carry-on at her feet and her leather folder tucked under her arm and her eyes fixed on Victor Harlan with a steadiness that finally made him blink. He looked away first. He looked at the guard, and then back at Evelyn, and then at the assembled crowd of passengers, watching with the riveted attention of people at an event they had not paid for, but were getting for free. And something in the fact of that attention, all those eyes, the phones, the stillness of the crowd, did something to Victor Harlan that a less fragile composure might have withstood. He turned to the uniformed guard to his left. "Please escort this guest to the secondary verification area," he said. It was a sentence designed to sound administrative. It was a sentence designed to make her disappear. And then Victor Harlan made a mistake he would spend the rest of his career, which was now, though he did not know it, already almost over trying to take back. Whether it was the heat, or the crowd watching, or some old reflex of authority that had never before been challenged at its root, nobody would ever know with certainty. What the security footage would later show, without ambiguity, was this. Victor Harlan raised his right hand and struck Evelyn Brooks across the left side of her face. Not a push, not a gesture, a strike, open-handed, hard enough to turn her head. In front of approximately 230 passengers, 7 crew members, and 3 cameras he had apparently forgotten existed. The sound was a single flat crack in the morning air. Then there was nothing. No breath. No voice. The dock went silent, in a way that docks almost never go silent, the kind of silence that happens when the world's background noise suddenly seems inappropriate. The jazz from the hidden speakers continued for 3 more seconds, and then someone, somewhere, turned it off. Evelyn's head turned with the impact. She steadied herself. She did not stumble. She brought her face back around and looked at Victor Harlan with an expression that would be described differently by every person who saw it. Some said it was fury. Some said it was grief. Some said it looked, impossibly, like patience. The teenager with the phone was filming openly now. 2 other passengers had their phones up. A woman near the back pressed her hand over her mouth. Victor Harlan was breathing hard, his composure fractured for the first time, his face cycling through expressions he no longer had control over, something like surprise, as if what he had done had happened to him, rather than by him. "Remove her," he said, his voice cracking on the second word. The guard did not move immediately. He was looking at Victor the way animals look at a thunderstorm alert, uncertain, aware that something fundamental had just changed in the atmosphere, and that the old protocols no longer fully applied. Victor repeated himself, louder this time, and the loudness of it was its own kind of fracture, the authority it was trying to assert already undermined by the desperation behind it. The guard stepped forward. Evelyn raised her hand, a small and precise gesture, and the guard stopped. "There's no need," Evelyn said, and her voice was quiet and entirely steady in a way that should not have been possible. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at Victor Harlan one last time. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said. Not with heat, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, with the precise flatness of a statement of fact, the way a navigator announces a change in heading, directional, not emotional. Nobody on that dock laughed, nobody cheered, nobody said anything at all. Several people, reviewing their own silence later, in their cabins or at dinner that evening, or lying awake at 3 in the morning with the ship moving steadily beneath them, would feel something they could not quite name, not quite shame, not quite guilt, but something in the neighborhood of both. They had watched, they had filmed, They had stood in a circle of their own inaction and let it happen. Not one of them had said stop. Inside the bridge, 3 decks above the boarding area, Captain Daniel Marsh was going over the morning's departure checklist with his first officer when his personal radio crackled. Not the general channel, his direct line, the one connected to the Aurora's corporate operations center in Miami. He picked it up with the mild expectation of a routine communication. What he heard instead was the strained voice of the company's director of operations, a woman named Patricia Wellstone, who had been in the cruise industry for 27 years, and whose voice Daniel had never heard at that particular frequency. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to confirm, has Miss Evelyn Brooks boarded the Aurora?" He told her no. He told her there had been some kind of issue at check-in, though he did not know the details. The silence on the line had a weight to it that was distinctly different from routine silence. "Daniel," Patricia said, and her voice had dropped to something very quiet, something below the register she used for operational problems. "What kind of issue?" He said he would find out and call back within 5 minutes. He did not call back. He handed the radio to his first officer and walked off the bridge at a pace that stopped just short of a run. He moved through the ship with the focused speed of a man who has just understood that something he thought was distant is actually very close. He was 58 years old, 31 years at sea, the last 7 as captain of the Aurora. He had managed storms and mechanical failures and medical emergencies and passenger disputes of nearly every variety the sea and human nature could generate between them. He had never, in 3 decades, moved through his own ship with quite this particular quality of urgency, not the urgency of emergency, but the urgency of someone who knows that every second of delay has consequences that seconds cannot undo. The crew members he passed in the corridors tracked him with their eyes, and then exchanged glances with each other. Word was already moving through the ship's lower decks, in the way that word always moves through a ship faster than it has any right to, carried on nothing visible, arriving everywhere at once. By the time Daniel reached the boarding level, 6 of his senior officers had quietly repositioned themselves within sight of the check-in area. They had not been ordered to do so. They had simply understood, the way people understand things in enclosed systems where everyone's fate is connected, that something significant was happening and that their presence might matter. Daniel came through the door from the interior corridor and stopped. He took in the scene in the way experienced officers take in scenes comprehensively, in a single sweep, prioritizing without appearing to calculate. Evelyn Brooks standing precisely where she had been standing, her posture unchanged, her leather folder still under her arm. Victor Harlan standing 3 feet away, his face the color of old chalk, his body carrying the rigid stillness of someone who has run out of moves. The crowd of passengers arranged in the rough semicircle of people who have witnessed something they cannot stop watching and have not yet decided whether to walk away from. The guard, motionless. The cameras, mounted in their fixed positions on the overhead struts, their little red indicator lights burning steadily in the morning light. Daniel did not ask what had happened. Patricia Wellstone had told him enough, and the footage from those cameras would fill in everything else. He looked at Evelyn Brooks for a long moment, long enough that several people in the crowd noticed it and wondered what the look meant. Then he walked to her. He stopped 2 feet away. He placed his right hand over his heart, and he bowed. Not a nod, not a tilt of the head, a full, deliberate bow, the kind that leaves no ambiguity about what it means or who it is for. The dock was so quiet that the water slapping gently against the hull sounded loud. When he straightened, his face was clear and composed and deeply serious. "Miss Brooks," he said, "on behalf of this company and this crew, I am profoundly sorry for what has happened to you today. There is no explanation that is adequate, and I am not going to offer one. I am sorry." He said it twice. Not for effect twice, because the first time, he was not sure she had fully heard it over the internal noise of the moment, and he needed her to hear it. Evelyn looked at him. Her expression did not soften immediately. It was not the expression of someone waiting for an apology to arrive, because she had not been waiting. She had been enduring, but something in the steadiness of Daniel's gaze, the completeness of his posture, the absence of qualification from his words, moved something in her face that had been very still. Victor Harlan had not moved. His expression was the expression of a man watching his own future disappear in real time, not in a dramatic rush, but in the slow, categorical way that buildings are condemned. He opened his mouth once and then closed it. There was genuinely nothing to say. The position had no door, no exit, no angle that did not lead to the same place. The passengers around him were still mostly silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of reckoning, which is a different and heavier thing. Daniel turned and looked at Victor. "Your access card," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not add anything to it. Victor unclipped the card from his breast pocket and held it out. His hand was not quite steady. Daniel took it. "You are relieved of duty. Pending a full review," he said. "Please do not leave the vessel." Victor nodded once, a single mechanical motion, and then he was still emptied, somehow, of whatever had been filling him all morning. The crowd exhaled. Not all at once in staggered breaths, as though they were each individually coming back from somewhere far away. A few people lowered their phones. One woman pressed her fingers to her lips. A man near the back of the crowd sat down on a boarding bench with the slow, controlled descent of someone whose legs have just reminded him how long he has been standing. The junior staff member who had been displaced from the check-in counter when Victor approached Evelyn stepped quietly back to her station. The jazz, which no one had turned back on, remained off. The morning proceeded without it. What most people on that dock did not know, what only a small number of people connected to the Aurora's corporate ownership had ever been told, was that Evelyn Brooks was not simply a passenger with a valid booking and a scuffed suitcase. She was, in the language of the maritime industry, a foundation stone. 21 years earlier, she had built a logistics company from nothing, truly from nothing, from a fold-up table in a rented room in Baltimore, with a used laptop and a phone plan she shared with her sister, into one of the most efficient maritime freight coordination operations on the East Coast. She had an instinct for systems, for the invisible architecture beneath the visible surface of things, that her competitors spent years trying to reverse engineer and never quite managed. By the time she sold the company, 14 years after founding it, she had created over 400 full-time jobs, established long-term contracts with 17 major shipping clients, and moved enough cargo across Atlantic corridors to fill a mid-sized city's annual import needs several times over. She had not spent the money on visible things. She had no mansion, no fleet of vehicles, no properties in fashionable coastal markets. She had a townhouse in Baltimore that needed new gutters and a kitchen faucet which she had never gotten around to replacing because it ran fine, and the idea of spending money on a signal when the thing itself still functioned struck her as exactly the kind of reasoning she had no patience for. People who had known her professionally sometimes visited and came away, confused the woman who had moved freight across 3 coastal corridors and negotiated contracts with companies that had legal teams larger than her entire staff, was drinking coffee from a machine that cost $30 and sitting on a sofa she had bought used 15 years ago. It was not performance. It was simply who she was. Underneath everything that she had accomplished, and everything that had accumulated around the accomplishing, what she had done, quietly and without announcement, was establish a maritime safety and workforce development fund, a private foundation with no public name attached to it, no press releases, no charitable galas with photographers. The fund had trained over 1,200 merchant sailors in safety protocols that had, by conservative industry estimates, prevented at least 7 significant incidents at sea over the previous decade. It had provided navigation and communications equipment to underfunded port operations across 3 coastlines. And 9 years ago, when the parent company of the Aurora Cruise Line had been facing a debt restructuring that would have required selling off significant assets, including the Aurora herself, the company's most recognized vessel, the fund had provided a bridge financing arrangement that allowed the company to reorganize without liquidating its flagship. The terms had been reasonable. The discretion had been absolute. The single condition attached to the arrangement had been non-disclosure. Evelyn had not wanted her name attached to any of it. She had not wanted a suite named in her honor, a plaque in the ship's lobby, or a thank you in the company's annual report. She had wanted the ship to keep sailing, the sailors to keep working, and her name to stay entirely out of it. Only the company's board of directors, and, by the operational necessity of his position, the captain of the Aurora knew the full picture. Daniel Marsh had known for 6 years who Evelyn Brooks was. He had known when Patricia Wellstone called his direct line in that altered voice exactly what had happened and exactly how deep the roots of it ran. He had not run through those corridors because of her money or her foundation or the financing arrangement of 9 years ago. He had run because a person had been struck on his ship's boarding dock in front of his crew and his passengers, and that alone was reason enough. That the person was Evelyn Brooks made the morning more complicated, but the running had started before the complication. The board convened an emergency meeting that was held, in slightly surreal fashion, in the ship's business center, a room appointed with polished conference table, ergonomic chairs, and a presentation screen usually used for investor calls and itinerary planning sessions. The people who filled those chairs were board members who had flown in for the voyage, senior operations executives who were technically on vacation, and two company attorneys who had appeared with the efficiency of people who are always ready for exactly this kind of morning. Victor Harlan was summoned and seated at the far end of the table. He had collected himself somewhat, his expression had returned to something approaching composure, though it was the fragile composure of a man performing calm rather than feeling it. He spoke for 8 minutes. He said the boarding documentation had appeared inconsistent with the booking record on file, that he had followed standard guest verification protocols, that the situation had escalated in a manner he deeply regretted. He used the word regret 4 times, and the phrase in my professional judgment 3 times, and the word unfortunate twice. He did not use the word strike. He used the phrase physical contact once, in a subordinate clause. Then the head of security services brought up the camera feeds. The footage from 3 separate angles was projected onto the conference room's presentation screen in sequence. It was clear. It was unambiguous. The escalation that Victor had described as mutual was visible, on camera, as entirely one-directional. The documentation he had claimed to find inconsistent was shown being reviewed, and the review, frame by frame, showed nothing irregular at any point. And then the frame that nobody in the room could look away from. Victor Harlan's hand, rising, and the movement of Evelyn's head with the impact, and the 2 seconds afterward, in which the entire dock appeared to stop breathing. Every person at that table had the look of someone who has bitten into something they cannot spit out. The 2 most senior directors had the additional, specific look of people calculating consequences in real-time legal exposure, reputational exposure, regulatory exposure, while simultaneously trying to keep their faces neutral. Victor's access card had already been collected. His employment, pending the formal investigation that was now a formality rather than a process, was suspended with immediate effect. The word termination was not said aloud in that room, but it occupied every corner of it with the comfortable certainty of something already decided. Evelyn was asked if she would be willing to speak with the board. She agreed. She came to the business center and sat at the conference table with the same straightforward quiet she had brought to the check-in queue, the dock, and every other room in this story. She was offered water, which she accepted. She was offered a formal apology, which she received without ceremony, no theater, no visible emotion, just a slight nod to indicate she had heard it and was prepared to proceed. The company's chairman, a man named Harold Ashford, who had been in the maritime hospitality industry for 38 years, asked her what she wanted. It was a carefully calibrated question. It was meant to open the conversation toward settlement, toward financial compensation, toward the kinds of remedies that money can provide, and that can be quietly concluded before a situation reaches its widest possible audience. Evelyn set down her water glass. She looked at Harold Ashford with the same directness she had brought to every room she had ever entered uninvited. "I don't want money," she said, with the completeness of someone who has already considered it and moved past it. "I don't want an upgrade. I don't want a gesture." She looked around the table at the directors, the attorneys, the executives with their careful expressions. "I want you to change something real." There was a pause in which no one was sure how to proceed. Harold Ashford leaned forward slightly. "Tell us what you mean," he said, and Evelyn did. She talked for 20 minutes, without notes, without performance. She said that what had happened to her on the dock that morning was not unusual. It was unusual in its escalation and its visibility and the specific violence at its conclusion. But the judgment that had preceded it, the decision made in the first 30 seconds of seeing her, that was ordinary. That happened every day, on ships, and in hotels, and in restaurants, and in airports, and in every space designed for the comfort of the few, to people who did not have her particular standing, and who had no lever to pull when it did. She said the industry had a habit of treating dignity as a premium add-on, something that came with the right kind of booking, the right kind of luggage, the right kind of face. She said that was the thing that needed to change. Not a policy on paper that nobody read. A genuine, structural change in how the company trained its people to see not what to see, but how to look in the first place. She said it without righteousness. She said it the way people say true things when they have been saying them for a long time, and have finally been given a room large enough to say them in. She told them about the security guard at the department store when she was 17. She told them about the restaurant in Atlanta where she had been seated near the kitchen on 3 separate occasions across as many years, always when she was alone, always when she was well-dressed, always in a restaurant that had tables by the window that were never offered to her. She told them about the conference room in Boston where she had arrived as the keynote speaker for a maritime logistics summit and been directed by 2 different people to the catering entrance before anyone thought to look at her name on the program. She did not tell these stories for effect. She told them because the men and women in this room had, by their positions, the ability to change the systems that produced those stories, not to apologize for the stories after they had happened, but to make the conditions that generated them less likely. You have power over how your people are trained to see, she said. That is what I am asking you to use. The room was quiet when she finished, not the quiet of discomfort, but the quiet of people who have been accurately measured and are deciding what to do about it. Daniel Marsh, seated 2 chairs from the chairman, was watching Evelyn with the expression of someone who is hearing clearly articulated what they have always partially understood, but never quite found the language for. He made 2 pages of notes in a small leather notebook. The board was quiet in a way that was different from the quietness of Victor's presentation that had been the quiet of people waiting to manage something. This was the quiet of people receiving something. Harold Ashford asked questions, and they were not defensive questions, not the questions of a man protecting his company's legal exposure. They were the questions of someone who had just been shown, clearly and without theater, that the floor of the building he thought he was standing on had a crack in it that ran deeper than the morning's incident. The meeting lasted just over 2 hours. When it ended, a set of commitments had been established that were specific enough to be measured. Mandatory dignity and inclusion training for every guest-facing crew member, a new anonymous guest feedback system with independent review, a quarterly audit of service interaction patterns, and the appointment of an external ombudsperson within 60 days. These commitments were not made because the board was afraid of publicity. They were made because Evelyn had walked into a room full of powerful people and spoken without fear or agenda, and something in the clarity of it had made the usual defenses seem beside the point. That evening, after the ship had moved through its departure preparations, and the last of the administrative arrangements had been concluded, Daniel Marsh asked Evelyn's permission to address the assembled passengers before the evening program. She gave it. He stood at the front of the ship's main salon, a room of warm wood paneling, and low lighting and round tables, set with linens that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and spoke without notes. He was brief. He told the passengers, with a directness that surprised even the ones who had been expecting some kind of managed apology, that an incident had occurred that morning that was inconsistent with the values of the ship and the company, and that the individual responsible was no longer part of the crew. He told them that the woman at the center of that incident was a guest on this voyage, and that she had chosen, after everything that had happened, to remain not because the morning had been resolved, but because she had come here for a reason that mattered more to her than Victor Harlan's cruelty. He said that she had spent the afternoon speaking to the company's leadership, not to seek compensation, but to push for change, and that the change she had asked for was harder and more valuable than money. It required something from every person involved in the service of other people, not only the ones who behaved badly in visible ways. He paused there. He looked around the room. Several of the people who had been on the dock that morning could not quite meet his eyes. A luxury ship, he said, is not defined by its ticket price or the quality of its furnishings. It is defined by the quality of its dignity, the way it treats every single person who steps on board, regardless of what they look like, regardless of what they are wearing, regardless of any assumption. A person in a position of authority chooses to make in the first 30 seconds of seeing them. He let that sit. Then he said, A ship is only as good as the respect that moves through it. Someone began to applaud, not theatrically, just a man near the back in a plain shirt, who wanted to indicate that he had heard and understood and was glad it had been said. The applause spread through the room in the gradual way of something genuine rather than something performed. Evelyn, sitting at a table near the window with a cup of tea she had been too distracted to drink, received the moment with the same quietness she had brought to everything else in this long, strange day. She did not stand. She did not raise her glass or her hand. What moved across her face briefly, before the composure settled back, was not pride. It was something softer and more private and harder to name. Something like the feeling of having carried something heavy for a very long time and having been, at last, permitted to set it down. Several passengers came to her table afterward. They came alone and in pairs. With the careful approach of people who understand, they are asking for something, not for her forgiveness, exactly, but for something in the neighborhood of it. One woman, who had been near the front of the crowd on the dock that morning, sat down across from Evelyn and held her hands and said she was sorry she had not spoken up when it would have mattered. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. "The fact that you know that," she said, "is where it starts." The woman nodded. She left. Others came. Evelyn received each of them with the patience of someone who had not come here for this, but who understood that it was necessary. A man named Robert, a retired attorney from Chicago, came to her table last. He had been on the dock that morning, standing near the back of the crowd, and he had done what attorneys learn to do in situations whose parameters they have not yet fully assessed. He had observed without committing. He had watched and said nothing. He sat across from Evelyn now, with the specific discomfort of someone who is used to being the person who reads situations correctly, and who has discovered, on a cruise ship boarding dock in full Florida morning sunshine, that he had read this one wrong. He told her he was a lawyer. He said he had known, watching the situation unfold, that something was off. He said he had told himself that he didn't know enough of the facts, that it wasn't his place, that surely someone more directly involved would intervene. He said those things to Evelyn, now in the tone of a man presenting evidence at his own trial. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The hardest person to hold accountable is the one who does nothing wrong, exactly, who just waits." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was exactly right." He thanked her. He went back to his table. That exchange, too, would stay with him in the cases he took afterward, in the moments in rooms where something was happening, and the question was whether to speak or wait. He would hear it again, small and clear, like a compass, finding north. Victor Harlan was on a flight back to Miami before the ship reached international waters. His termination was processed formally in the days that followed the documentation, noting, in the efficient and bloodless language of corporate HR, conduct inconsistent with company standards, violation of anti-discrimination policy, and physical assault of a guest. He would spend the months that followed in the particular silence of a man who built his professional identity on the safety of certain judgments and discovered, in a single morning, in front of 3 cameras and 200 witnesses, how completely he had misunderstood the foundations of his own authority. Whether that silence led to something useful, whether the morning on the dock became, for him, a reckoning or only a catastrophe, nobody on the Aurora ever knew. The ship had moved on. The sea had moved on. Daniel Marsh remained captain of the Aurora. His conduct during the incident was noted in the company's formal review and commended without ceremony, the commendation being, precisely, that he continued in his position, which was both appropriate and the outcome he would have preferred. He was not celebrated for doing the right thing. He was simply allowed to keep doing it. In the quiet arithmetic of professional life, that was its own kind of recognition. The Aurora departed Miami for Barcelona on a Tuesday morning that had started in confusion and cruelty and ended in something more difficult to categorize, not resolution, not peace, but something in the direction of both. The ship was 53 minutes late leaving the harbor. No announcements were made explaining the delay. Passengers who had not witnessed the morning's events assumed weather or scheduling. Those who had been on the dock carried it with them through the voyage as a piece of unasked-for luggage through the slow blue days at sea, the port stops in cities that smelled of bread and sun and stone, the dinners and the sunsets, and the long nights where the ship's engines were the only sound. By the end, many of them were quietly glad to have it. The passage took 11 days. During those 11 days, a few things happened that nobody had planned for. The anonymous guest feedback system that the company had promised to build in 60 days had its first informal version operational within 72 hours of the ship's departure. Not because the board had moved quickly, but because 3 junior members of the technology staff, who had heard what Evelyn had asked for and found themselves unable to wait, built a rough prototype on their own time and presented it to Daniel Marsh at breakfast on the second day at sea. He approved its deployment by lunch. It received 47 responses before the ship reached the Azores. None of them were about the food or the cabin temperatures. They were about the small moments. A porter who had asked a guest if they needed help without waiting to be asked. A crew member who had remembered a guest's name from the previous evening. A dining attendant who had quietly rearranged a table without comment so that an elderly passenger could sit more comfortably. The system was capturing the texture of dignity in small daily exchanges, which was precisely what Evelyn had described when she spoke about what needed to change. Marcus, the young trainee from Georgia who had spoken to Evelyn at the railing on the first evening, spent part of the voyage talking to other trainees about what he had witnessed on the dock. Not in any official capacity, not as a program or an initiative, just in the way young people on ships talk to each other in the hours between duties, in the crew mess, or on the lower decks where the passengers do not go. He described what he had seen. He described Evelyn's stillness. He described the way she had said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," without a tremor in her voice, and the way Daniel had bowed, and the way the crowd had exhaled. He was not old enough yet to have the language for what it meant, but he knew it had mattered, and the knowing was its own kind of beginning. 3 of the trainees he spoke to would later, in their own careers, remember that account not as a lesson formally received, but as something lived at one remove, inherited through the telling. Evelyn stood at the rail of Deck 7 as the Aurora moved into the open water of the Strait of Florida. The sky had gone the deep fading amber of late evening, and the sea was accepting it and transforming it into something darker and more permanent. The wind off the water was steady and cool against her face. She had changed into a cotton sweater. Her hands rested on the railing. She was watching the water move, just that, which was what she had come here to do. She had traveled a great deal in her life, mostly for work, mostly to places that needed her in some practical capacity. She had not, in recent memory, traveled anywhere simply because it was beautiful. Gloria had told her, on the phone the night before departure, to actually sit down and enjoy it. She had promised she would try. Standing at the railing now, with the water moving below her and the sky doing its enormous quiet work above, she thought she was finally managing it. A young crew member moving along the deck saw her and slowed. He was perhaps 22 years old, a maritime trainee from Georgia named Marcus, who had been on the dock that morning and who had watched what happened with the particular helpless attention of someone who has not yet acquired enough standing to intervene and enough conscience to be unable to forget it. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Brooks," he said. She turned. He was searching for the right shape for what he wanted to say. The words kept coming out wrong in his head, too small for what he meant, too formal, too casual, all of them insufficient. Finally, he said, "I'm glad you're here, on the ship, that you stayed." Evelyn looked at him. Something moved across her expression, quick and warm and real. "So am I," she said. He nodded. He moved on along the deck, back to whatever his evening duties required of him. She turned back to the water. The lights of Miami had long since disappeared behind them. Ahead, there was only open water, and the dark in the distance to somewhere worth going. The Aurora moved steadily forward. On the deck of cabin 714, with a cotton sweater and the wind on her face and the whole wide dark Atlantic ahead, Evelyn Brooks watched the light go out of the sky and thought nothing in particular, which was, after everything, exactly what she had come here to do. Respect is the highest class anyone can wear.